5 weeks later, Arabella arrived at Chester Cottage, the home of her cousin Simon Ashby in Oxfordshire. She stepped from her carriage, handed down by William the footman, and was greeted by Simon and his wife Beatrice. Simon, a barrister, was a nervous man, thin and pale, with watery eyes and light brown hair, worn a bit longer than the current fashion, but as he was her only living relative on her father's side of the family, she felt quite tenderly toward him. "We were so very sorry to hear of your loss," he said. "He was a very good man," Arabella replied, "and I miss him dearly." She blinked away tears. The last 5 weeks had been very hard. Even though father's passing, so distant in time as well as space, had not affected the family in any immediate or practical sense, the loss had affected Arabella greatly. Inconsolable, she had taken to her bed for days at a time, refusing food, water, and solace. Beatrice, a plump girl with tiny hands, offered Arabella a handkerchief. "When your mother wrote to us of the depth of your grief," she said, "offering our humble home for a brief respite was the least we could do." "I thank you for your kindness, and I extend my mother's thanks as well." Arabella took a deep breath and looked about herself. Chester Cottage was indeed quite humble, and rather far removed from town, but it was at least a fresh locale, lacking any memories for Arabella. Everything at Marlow Hall reminded her of her loss. Whenever she managed to forget for a moment that her father had passed away, she would immediately catch a glimpse of Fanny, all in black, or the shrouded mirrors, or the black mourning wreath that hung over the front door, and grief would come flooding back. Even the automaton harpsichord player, the one thing that had kept her sane in the last few months, now served only to remind her of her father. The very sight of it brought tears to her eyes. Arabella shook her head, dispelling the memory. "I suppose I should also extend my condolences to you," she said. "He was, after all, your uncle." "You are too kind," Simon said, and bowed his head, but his expression, Arabella thought, was rather sour, and she wondered at this. They led Arabella into the cottage and introduced her to infant Sophie, their firstborn, who was not yet 2 months old. Then they showed Arabella the room which would be hers during her stay. It was small and rather shabbily furnished, in keeping with the rest of the house, and as her things were brought in from the carriage, Arabella could not help but notice that the Ashbys of Chester Cottage had only a single servant, an elderly maid-of-all-work called Jane. But, despite the meanness of her cousin's circumstances, they had offered her hospitality, and there was nothing here to remind her of her father. Arabella determined to be grateful for the opportunity to rest her battered spirit.